As I'm still in the finishing stages of the next heavy-duty piece of mechanical exploration on this channel, I wanted to once again pepper you with a bunch of cool, weird, interesting, and occasionally iconic images from Gearhead history and give you the background on them. In this collection of 18 images, we'll go everywhere from the road to the sea to the skies in our pursuit of historical knowledge and fun. Now, all that being said, let's get on with the images and the funny, sometimes sad, and always interesting stories behind them. A big, red, trust me on that part, drag strip sled. Gary and Charlene Wood campaigned this awesome 1972 Pontiac Le Mans station wagon in the 1970s with great success. To me, the look of a drag racing wagon can't be beat, and this Pontiac with its T41 nose is even cooler than that. Believe it or not, Charlene won in the car more than her husband Gary did. The 455 Pontiac-powered wagon was known for doing exactly what it's doing here, hiking the left front tire a foot plus off the ground. Now, getting crafty with torque converters and some trick camshaft grinds made this car a destroyer in the J-Stock automatic competition of the 1970s and 80s. The fact that this thing ran high 11s and low 12s under the highly restrictive rules of stock eliminator is amazing. Factory carburetor in place, factory cylinder heads, factory intake manifold, and a camshaft that had to have factory lift but could have any sort of modified duration. Stock eliminator was and continues to be a class about the ability to super tune factory parts. A fun fact to share is the fact that Gary once added a third-row seat to the car, which allowed him to run a different category in stock because of the horsepower and weight factoring NHRA does. Now, you can try that with a traditional race car, they'll laugh you right out of the joint, but with a massive Pontiac wagon, more the merrier. Gary Wood was a long time and very smart Pontiac racer before ever getting national recognition with tons of fun, one of my favorite stock eliminator cars from the annals of NHRA history. You know, you just can't trust a dictator. In the late 1970s, Umberto Eco, who owned and operated a massive civil engineering firm in northern Italy, got a contract for an earth-moving job in Libya that far outstripped anything he had ever seen before. The country was being run by Colonel Gaddafi at the time, and the intention of the project was not known and really never fully explained. Anywho, Eco decided that he needed some special iron to make this job feasible, and because of that, his company designed and constructed the largest bulldozer and motor grader the world had ever seen. Now, this is the grader, more than 20 feet wide, making 1,700 horsepower, with a 700 horsepower engine up front and a 1,000 horsepower engine out back, weighing 400,000 pounds, wearing 12 massive tires and pushing a 33-foot wide blade. It was astonishingly awesome. Then the sand hit the fan. The UN accused Libya of being a terrorist state and levied sanctions on the country. The machine would never actually be shipped to Libya, and Eco had the world's largest yellow paperweight. The machine was used on one job in southern Italy, but because of the huge cost to move it, it never actually saw work again. Used as a museum piece for a while, it's been cut up for scrap. The massive dozer does still live as a stationary display. Now here's a lesson, kids. Never build a fancifully massive piece of machinery on the empty guarantees of a dictator. Ah yes, early aircraft carriers tackling the tough waters of Lake Michigan. Yeah, you're looking at the USS Sable up top and the USS Wolverine on the bottom. These were two carriers built right around 1942, and they sailed around Lake Michigan. No, they never saw combat or touched salt water and never met the enemy in anger, but they made a mighty contribution to the war effort. These were used as training carriers for pilots that would see air combat. Guys like George Herbert Walker Bush trained their takeoffs and landings on these ships, but the stories are much cooler than that. Both ships were built around 1912 as big pleasure liners that would take people for overnight trips between cities or to places like Niagara Falls. They were side-wheeler paddle vessels and powered by coal-fired steam boilers. So yes, if anybody ever asks you in a quiz if the Navy had paddle-wheel aircraft carriers, the answer is yes, and they were weird. The SS C&B, which became the USS Wolverine, was an elegant ship, as was the SS Greater Buffalo, which became the Sable. 500 feet long and 98 feet wide, the ship had 510 passenger rooms, saloons, and all the stuff a giant pleasure ship would have. By 1942, it was kind of a useless relic, and no one was traveling that much at that time anyway. Sold for a song to the government, by the fall of that year, it was being converted into a flat top. Massive amounts of steel bracing were added to support the flight deck, and an aircraft carrier she became. The two ships mentioned here are the only paddle wheel carriers in history. The steam engines made 8,000 horsepower, and the ships would make about 18 knots at full song, belching smoke like a tire fire. By 1945, both were sold for scrap iron when the war was over. 130 to 200 planes were lost due to accidents during training. 35 have been fished from the lake. Now the best thing? 116,000 landings were made, and only 8 people lost their lives. Amazing considering they were all brand new carrier pilots learning how to do the job, and on Lake Michigan. Now you know. This is the biggest and most awesome racing plane of all time. Seriously. This is the famed Super Snoopy of legendary pilot and aviation business genius Clay Lacy. Lacy was many things, but a really awesome air racer, and his P-51 was one of them. Well, in 1970, air racers decided to try something new, a 1,000-mile unlimited air race. Run what you brung. A 15-mile pylon course was set and the planes would race. All the hot rods were there, and then Lacy came rumbling in with a 13,000-horsepower Douglas DC-7. Was it a joke? Far from it. The 1,000-mile distance would mean pit stops for most of the teams, but not for this massive plane. 20 aircraft started. Lacy finished 6th in the most bombastic display of his flying career. Running this thing wide open the whole time, they were hauling along at 350-plus miles an hour, very low to the ground. Obviously, the smaller, more high-performance planes were cutting very tight corners around the pylons, something that would have caused this massive DC-7 to wreck. So to manage that, Lacy only used a 60 to 70 degree bank angle on the turns, which limited the G-load on the plane to 2.2 max. Now, the airplane consumed 4,000 gallons of aviation gasoline and 70 gallons of oil during the 3+ hours of the madness of the race. And yes, there is video you can find to watch. The winning airplane, a Lye Sea Fury, averaged 344 miles per hour to the 325 mile per hour average of the massive Super Snoopy. It's wild, right? Because of the huge size of the plane, it was made to take off last to start the race, as organizers figured it would blow everybody off the runway with all 4 engines churning. 112 feet long, 137 feet wide, and 31 feet tall, it is the largest plane to ever compete at a pylon race, and at about 80,000 pounds race weight, it is the heaviest as well. Amazingly, this airplane was in service until the mid-1980s in South America, when it was scrapped in Brazil sometime in 1985. Lacy lived into his upper 80s and may, if he's still alive now, be well into his 90s, and it wouldn't surprise me at all to hear he's still somewhere holding a control stick. Is it me, or is this just one of those things everybody needs? The coolest version of the Jeep CJ5 that you could buy was the Go4 Digger backhoe, and yes, you could order this thing right from your local dealer. As the CJ5 was way long in the tooth by the late 60s and early 70s, more and more specialty ideas were used to keep it interesting to potential buyers, and this was the ultimate. Featuring a Meyer half cab, a fully functional bulldozer blade in the front, the awesome backhoe in the rear, dual rear tires, a Dana 70 rear axle, a single seat in the cab, and a reinforced frame, this thing ruled. There was also a trencher which replaced the backhoe with a massive trenching saw, which is gnarly as well. Why would anybody want this? Well, think about it. Long before the mini excavators that exist today, this was a maneuverable, functional, very convenient option for digging trenches for drainage pipe or whatever else. The dozer blade in the front worked perfect to push your excavated dirt back into the hole or trench you just made, and you could be off to the next job. The power plant was the little 75 horsepower F-134 engine every other Jeep got, and interestingly, the front and rear gear ratios were different because of tire height. The front ran a 538 gear ratio, and the rear was a 587. Top speed? I'm guessing 50 miles an hour. Now, how did they sell? Tough to know, but they do occasionally come up for sale on the internet, and collectors leap at them. Video of the rigs working does exist, and I would absolutely love to own, or at least once in my life, cruise around and operate one of these magical little machines. This is a monster that destroyed everything but records. You are looking at the 1930s Australian land speed record chaser known as the Fred H. Stewart Enterprise, which was owned by Norm Smith and built by Smith and his pal Don Harkness. This is a leviathan of a thing that caused personal relationships to fail, financial drains no one could have seen coming, engineering disputes, and could actually probably be blamed for a stretch of horrible weather in New Zealand in the early 30s that was unparalleled in recorded history. Constructed through 1930 and 31, the machine used a massive Napier Lion engine loaned to the effort at the request of the Australian government. The car was 26 feet long, 70 inches wide, and 36 inches tall ahead of the cockpit. It was 42 inches tall at the top of the cockpit. The weight of the car was 6,700 pounds. It rode on 37-inch tall tires that were 7 inches wide. It had rear brakes only, and the group estimated that with all things being equal, they could go somewhere like 280 miles per hour. Now, the record was right around 250 miles per hour when they started this thing. So about the name, Smith and Harkness could not afford this madness on their own, so they went and looked for rich guys to help them. Fred H. Stewart agreed to foot most of the bill so long as the car was named after him, and so it was. Completed in late 1931, a huge rift had already formed between builders Smith and Harkness regarding to how to cool the engine. In October of 1931, Harkness had a nervous breakdown over the project. Smith hauled the car to New Zealand to run on a 90-mile beach, which is actually 55 miles but is called 90-mile beach, and then Smith got a restraining order on Harkness to keep him away from the car. The machine sat for a month, not because of the restraining order, but because of weather. On January 11, 1932, it took to the sand and went 228 miles per hour before spinning and finishing a 10-mile run at 150. The return run was made at 178 miles per hour, and a 10-mile average of 164 actually got them an international speed record for the highest average speed over a 10-mile course. Outside of that, they were horribly off of their world record pace. And from that point until May, the weather was so bad the car was parked. During a May 1st attempt, the engine caught fire. Smith jumped out of the car. It went into the garage, and it never ran again. Now, Smith went on to have a legendary racing career in Australia that he loved talking about for his entire life, except for the Enterprise. That really wasn't mentioned a whole lot. And they called her Waltzing Matilda. Owned by a guy named Terry O'Hare in Australia, this wild jet-powered monster ran a two-way average of 172.65 miles per hour in the flying mile on January 16, 1979, briefly touching speeds of 200 miles per hour during flying kilometer runs. In true Aussie fashion, these speed runs were crazy because they were made in northwestern Victoria, and they were made on public roads, which the government had signed off on the use for, but it's still pretty wild to consider. The truck was a late 1970s Ford LNT 7000, which used a Caterpillar 3208 diesel under the hood, and a Rolls-Royce Avon Mark I jet out back from an old Australian Air Force Canberra bomber. Then there was all the Star Wars-inspired accoutrement on top of that. The massive chin spoiler actually looks awesome. So the diesel engine was used to run stuff like the air brakes and to move the rig around and into position, and then the jet would be fired up and that would provide the main propulsion. The truck was run at drag strips and other events all over the country. During the 1979 publicity blitz worldwide of Tyrone Malone, he shipped his truck to Australia to match race with this thing. The Malone truck used a 1,300 horsepower engine. It was a Kenworth called the Super Boss, and they matched up at drag strips across the country. Well, the truck was later taken apart. Pieces of it has been used in a tribute/recreation of the rig. This thing really was awesome, and while it wasn't as quick as the Super Boss on the drag strip, it owned it in outright speed. Pretty wild to be thinking about 200 miles per hour in this thing, right? First off, read the caption. Secondly, no, it doesn't. You're looking at William E. Boyett and his insane version of a compressed air locomotive, which he said would travel at 125 miles per hour and cross the country in 24 hours. How? This is where it gets really good. As the February 1934 Modern Mechanics magazine said, quote, inventor Boyett claims his invention is quite simple, even though it runs contrary to all principles of engineering. And here's why. The concept was that a 4,800-pound auxiliary battery pack would spin an electric motor, which would turn a compressor to fill air tanks at 400 psi, which would get you moving. Once under power, the massive wheel-driven compressor would keep the tanks between 360 and 400 psi, while a generator behind the rear wheels of the 40-foot-long Mastodon would be spun by said wheels and recharge the batteries. So yes, he felt he had a perpetual motion machine on his hands. Electricity fills the tanks, movement recharges the batteries, and continually keeps the pressure up. The laws of thermodynamics tend to disagree with what Boyett was trying to do. Now, a test run was planned between Atlanta and Jacksonville when this story was written. There is no record of that actually happening. I mean, sure, this thing is pure fantasy, but just look how cool it is. See the steering arm? Did it get driven around off the tracks? There is no telling where it is now, but it was likely scrapped and cut into pieces, but it is still an amazingly cool failure. Did it fly? Oh, you better believe it did. Meet Ray Stitz in his 1952 Skybaby airplane. This was the second tiny plane that Stitz engineered and the pilot Bob Starr flew. See, Stitz at 180 pounds was too large and heavy to fly his own creation. The flyweight Star was gutsy and shapely enough to fit into the cockpit of this minuscule aircraft. The length from the prop to the tail is 9 feet 10 inches, and the wingspan a shocking 7 feet 2 inches. The resting height was 5 feet, and the weight was a wince-inspiring 666 pounds. Powered by an 85 horsepower Continental engine, it carried only a 5-gallon fuel tank, had a top speed of 185 miles per hour. Star said flying the thing was incredibly challenging. He would lock his arms and use his fingers to manipulate the stick, which had about 3 inches of travel from one side to the other. Using the foot pedals to move the rear rudder would place Star's feet about 4 inches from the whizzing prop when it was fully depressed. Star flew the plane at heights over 3,000 feet and achieved a top speed of 210 miles per hour in a shallow dive once. The plane still exists, and you can see it at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. The aircraft was a staple on the airshow tour for years. Believe it or not, Star would go on to build smaller planes in the 80s and crash, and then his son and Stitz would also continue the legacy of tiny aircraft. The ingenuity and engineering of prowess of Stitz is amazing, and the piloting skills of Star fit the bill perfectly. A truly ridiculous thing that's beyond captivating to look at and consider. August 1917. These men in this bizarre tank are fearlessly defending San Francisco. What? Yeah. The tank you see here was built by the Best Company and was effectively one of their 75 horsepower crawler tractors with a weird body and a turret on it. The turret held 2 6-pounder, meaning they fired 6-pound projectile guns, and outside of some stimulated battles and a handful of parade experiences, this thing's been totally lost to history. How did it work? There is no record of the guns ever actually being fired, which is the short answer. The longer answer is the turret did spin, but with the driver in the center of it. I wonder where and how the gunners are supposed to work in that scenario. Now, the tractor this thing was built on was awesome. It was just the tank part of it that it kind of sucked at. The Best 75 track layer was a 75 horsepower unit that used a 4-cylinder engine displacing 1,400 cubic inches. The bore in the stroke to get to 1,400 cubic inches at 4 cylinders is 7.5 inches bore by 8 inches stroke. Built for a 10-year run between 1913 and 1924, the 10-ton crawler had a 2-speed transmission and could travel at a fairly shocking 15 miles per hour. Now, sans the inverted hull of a body, these became really well-known and hard-working artillery tractors, dragging large guns all over the fighting areas of World War I. Believe it or not, by the end of the war, 2,000 of the Holt 75s were being used, with 445 of them being built under license in England. All World War I tanks were pretty weird, and to be honest, this one just needed some design tweaks and it might have succeeded. Instead, it looks like a weird steampunk machine photoshopped into a military image. Holt and Best would combine to form Caterpillar after years of suing each other over the rights to crawler tracks, which both companies used. What I'm telling you is that pigs can fly. This is perhaps the most awesome unblown gasser of the 1960s, known as the Filthy 40 and owned by Pennsylvania's Charlie Hill. Its all-conquering driver carried perhaps the most awesome name in drag racing history. The man's legal name was Pork Zartman. Running in and completely owning the C-Gas category, this purposefully ugly car carried a 14-to-1 compression 283. Hill & Company heavily reworked the heads, used Tilborn injection, a Crane valve train components, and a Vertex magneto to fire it all off. Insanely, the car used axle ratios on the order of 642, 658, or 668 in the Hallobrand quick change out back. A 1958 spec Borg-Warner stick-shift transmission was the unit they chose, and Zartman said 9,500 RPM through the traps was the norm. Okay, and all of this was happening in like 1961 and 1962. The car owned the East Coast in 62, winning races from Florida right on up to the Northeast. At the 1962 Nationals in Indy, they were in the final round, had a commanding performance gap on their Challenger, and left the radiator cap off the car before coming to the starting line, and they lost. For 1963, the car really became a weapon. The domination continued, and they smashed their way to a win at Indy, as they should have had the year before. The car held the record in 62, 63, and 64. They then stuffed a supercharged engine into it for a short time in 64, setting the B-Gas supercharged record for fun, and even with the smaller C-Gas engines in, the thing would still run 11s. And while the car may have looked bad, it was a machine way ahead of the pack in engineering. Where they placed the engine as far as height and into the chassis, as well as the traction bars, which can be seen in this photo that tie the rear axle to near the front center line of the entire car. It was all kind of a wonderful ruse, brilliance wrapped in what looked to be junk. At the 1962 Nationals, they parked in the mud on purpose. Every time they came to the line, the thing got worse and worse looking. And finally, wheel stands like this were a regular thing for this car, which also made it famous. At the Nationals, they were told to cut this practice out or leave, so they made a lead weight bar, bolted it to where the tow bar went, tied the front end of the car down because of that weight, and went even faster than they had before. Filthy, 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 indeed. August 27, 1949. Things have gone a bit topsy-turvy for Major Pete Braid. He had not envisioned his Cooper Mark II Formula 3 car to be neatly parked on the roof of a British Army Battalion HQ building, but, well, there it was. Of course, there's a story here. Back in late 1940s England, racing was a craze. The issue is that there were too few tracks for all the action people wanted. So creative as they were, racers noted that the perimeter road around the Blandford Army Camp would make one heck of a 3-mile-long road course. Motorcycle racing started there in 48, and by 49, the Royal Automobile Club sanctioned a car race to be held on August 27th of that year. It did not get off to a great start. A guy named Gordon Woods wrecked his Fraser Nash into a bus garage, demolishing it and himself in the process. As was the order of the day, the show went on. A couple of months into his F3 career, Braid was starting to feel his oats. Pushing his machine through the hard bends, he lost the handle on the little 500cc powered open-wheeled car. Skidding across the course and hitting a berm, he was shot back across the course and into the remains of the now flattened bus garage. He hit a section of that roof like a ramp, flew over a fir tree, and parked on the roof of the battalion headquarters. Thankfully, it was facing in the direction of traffic. Anyway, he had a couple of bruises and the indignity of seeing his car's rooftop perch for the rest of the event before it was removed. How it was removed, I don't know. He fixed the car and kept at it, running F3 into 1952. Now, they kept at it on the grounds of Blandford, but the body count continued to pile up into the 1950s, which didn't stop the racing, and they soldiered on into the early 60s on the same road. Sadly, Braid was killed in a train wreck on December 2, 1955 at the Barnes Railway Station. The Blandford Road is still there, but gates prevent anybody from making a full lap around its perimeter. Oh yes, it is an absolutely real thing. This is the Derby Broadside Steam Digger. Invented in the late 1800s over in England, as you can see, the 8 feet are attached to a giant crankshaft and dip into the ground up to 14 inches. As they come in and out, they turn over the soil. It was claimed that this machine could plow up to an acre an hour. A farmer named Thomas Darby invented this works. The guy you see here driving it was his right-hand man named Bob Hassler. What you cannot see in this photo is that the leading wheels that stabilize the whole thing from turning over and the large wheels that provide the motive force are front and rear. They are hidden by the angle of the picture. As described in the name, this iron giant moved broadside, not forward and backward. So as we see it here, the unit is driving away from us. 3 versions of the machine were made, and apparently a few were sold, perhaps even one all the way into Canada. As you can see, it is steam-powered, and unfortunately I don't have a lot more details to add other than that. Horsepower, weight, and other details are pretty hard to come by on these things. This was a wildly unique concept. So unique that it has been all but lost to the dustbin of stuff that worked, but just not quite well enough historically. As hard as it tried, at least it didn't sink itself. This is the USS Vesuvius, and it's one of the strangest warships ever built. See the 3 guns sticking out of the front of it? Those are not what you'd think they are. The ship was classified as a dynamite gun cruiser, because instead of the normal heavy guns on a ship, these had 3 massive air cannons capable of launching a 550-pound shell 1 mile. A 275-pound shell could go 2 miles using 1,000 psi of pressure. So why the heck do this? The ship fired shells full of dynamite instead of black powder. It was a gelatin-type dynamite that if shot out of a gun would have blown up, hence the push from air pressure. Now, as impressive as all this is, the guns were fixed, and the range was determined by how much pressure was used to launch the shells. The range was kind of crummy for a ship because it could not stay far enough away from the shore for short guns to shoot back at it. There's also the small matter of sailing around in a lightly armored ship full of dynamite. Reportedly, the captain once said, quote, "Once struck by an enemy shell, no funeral rites will be necessary for the men on board this boat." End quote. The boat was used only one time in anger, but it was successful. It was used to shell the Spanish forts at Santiago. The attack was done at night and worked very well. Now, the enemy was doubly terrified because there was no boom when a shell was fired. They just seemed to fall from the sky silently. After the Spanish-American War, it was turned into a vessel for testing torpedoes. From 1904 through 1913, it was a torpedo-testing darling. Then on May 13, 1904, the crew launched a torpedo, which went in a giant circle and struck their own ship. Thinking quick and working fast, the crew saved the Vesuvius from sinking. Fixed up and used for various menial tasks into the 1920s, it was sold for scrap in 1922. 4,000 horsepower, 70 crew, and 3 bizarre pneumatic cannons that shot gelatin dynamite shells. You just can't make this stuff up. The most beautiful race car you've never heard of. This is the Shakee DB1, and it was the brainchild of Doug Schultz and race car builder Bob McKee. The car name is a mashup of the two men's last names. Schultz, a racer, had been watching crowds dwindle from the halcyon days of the Can-Am series in the early 70s as he competed in the awesome but underappreciated Formula 5000 category, and this gave him an idea. In 1976, he developed a rules package for a Can-Am revival. The idea was really simple. Use the Formula 5000 Lolas and other chassis, but get bodies on them to recapture fan interest. He designed a scale model of the car and hit the road, pitching track owners and the SCCA on this fresh new take of Can-Am. The good thing is they bit. The series was green-lighted for 1977, and the building of the Shakee was on. 2 cars were made, one for Schultz and the other for racer Tom Klausler, who was looking to bust out of the Formula Atlantic division. The first race was at Saint-Jevy, Canada in 1977, June of that year, and only one of the cars was finished. Klausler actually qualified on the pole and won the race. The car you're looking at was highly competitive for most of the season, and what you're really looking at is a Lola T332 open-wheel car with an amazingly beautiful body on it. Packing a 5-liter small block Chevy, it sounded as good as it looked. Lola would introduce the T333 for Can-Am racing and dominate with it. With the body, the car was around 2,000 pounds. The machine had a fully enclosed roll cage, beat F1 cars to the ground effects era by a year, used vacuum-formed side windows that were actually NACA ducts acting as ram air for the engine, and had an in-car camera, making it the first of its kind. There is video of the cockpit camera, and it is amazing. You should Google it. The Can-Am series would troop on for another decade into the 80s before fading off into oblivion again. It never got back to its heyday, but Schultz's concept was solid, and a lot of racers like Al Unser Jr. and others had formative years in Can-Am competition. This is one of my all-time favorite race cars. It is visually arresting on every level, and the Shakee is worth investigating even deeper on your own. The Count loved his hot rods to death. This is the dashing Count Louis Zaborowski in his famed car Chitty Bang Bang, one of 4 he built with engineer Clyde Gallup. Yes, Ian Fleming was so taken by these behemoths that he crafted the famed book Chitty Chitty Bang Bang long before he created James Bond. This is the second version of the first car, shown here in 1921. Chain-driven and powered by a 23-liter, 6-cylinder Maybach aero engine, it was the fastest thing around when it debuted. Touching 100 miles per hour on England's famed Brooklyn circuit, the young Count was on top of the world. The version you see here actually ran 120 miles per hour at the same Brooklands track with better aero and some tweaking on the massive engine. When rebuilt, the car was sold to the son of Arthur Conan Doyle. Yes, the author of Sherlock Holmes. You just can't make this stuff up. Anyway, by the time version 4 came around in 1924, Zaborowski had established himself as a premier racing driver and was hired as a factory works pilot for Mercedes. He got their attention by running the 1923 Indy 500 and the 1923 Monza Grand Prix. In 1924, decked out and fully supported by Mercedes, he was again roaring around the Monza circuit when he struck a tree and was killed. In a creepy twist, he was wearing the same cufflinks his dad had worn when he was killed in a 1903 racing accident while hammered down in a Mercedes. The Count was a man wealthy beyond all but a few people in the world during his time. He literally inherited the ownership of a large portion of New York's Fifth Avenue and millions more in real estate around the globe. Now, his story is not uncommon for that era, aside from the fact that one of his marvelous machines inspired a children's book which is still sold today. Oh, and about that fourth Chitty Bang Bang. It was renamed Babs by J.G. Parry Thomas, driven to a world record speed of 171 miles per hour, and shortly thereafter killed its driver and owner in a wreck. It was buried in the beach of Pendine Sands for 40 years before being dug up and restored, and the car does still exist today. One famed moment in time. The rider is Raleigh Free, the year is 1948. The motorcycle is the first Vincent Black Lightning on American shores. the speed, an electrifying 150 miles per hour. Free was a well-known quantity in American racing at this point. He had competed at the Indy 500 twice, he had raced at the Daytona 200 motorcycle trials back in the 30s, he was a champion distance rider on Indian motorcycles, and he had fought the rise of Harley-Davidson tooth and nail on tracks of board, dirt, and public roadways. But it was here at the Bonneville Salt Flats that Raleigh Free became immortal in American motorsports. The Vincent Black Lightning was the follow-up act to the company's Vincent Black Shadow, the granddaddy to all the superbikes we know today. Its horsepower, its chassis, and performance were otherworldly for the day, and it would be the weapon that Free would use to land his deepest blow against his arch-rival brand of Harley-Davidson. On his first run at Bonneville, he was already well ahead of the 11-year-old record set by Joe Petrali on a Harley-Davidson. After several attempts, Free was in the books with a two-way average of 148.13 miles per hour, burying his mechanical nemesis, but Raleigh Free wanted more. His leathers had actually torn during his earlier 148-mile-per-hour blasts. Now, Free had developed a riding style for high-speed runs of removing the rear seat and laying on the rear fender straight out like Superman to be more aerodynamic on the motorcycle. Normally, he did this in full gear with a helmet, boots, and all the other riding garb of the day. For the 150-mile-an-hour record run, he decided to ditch it all because he thought the flapping leathers were slowing him down. For his helmet, he switched to a swimming cap. For his boots, a pair of borrowed flip-flops. And for his leathers, he went with a Speedo bathing suit borrowed from friend Ed Kretz. Famously, Free was quoted as saying, quote, "I stole the swimming trunks idea from Ed Kretz, who used to do the same thing on the Southern California dry lakes. Incidentally, Ed looks much nicer in the swimsuit than I do." End quote. Free launched off, kept his head straight down, simply staring at the black line to keep straight, and rocketed his way into motorcycle history in a Gearhead legend with a speed of 150.31 miles per hour across the salt. And that makes for an incredible photo. Well, that's the end of this exploration of these Gearhead images from across the centuries, across the surfaces, and across the histories of performance, racing, competition, and even warfare. I'm Ryan Loans. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to follow the channel and stay up to date with all the wild drops we do from history on machines from the mundane to the insane. Thanks again for watching.